Happy Place Home Studios.
Welcome back to our Happy Place Home Studio series, Replacing the Heart of Your Studio. This is part 2 of that series, Updating and Upgrading the Ecosystem. Well, what is the ecosystem? We're talking about the ecosystem around the heart of your studio, which of course is your computer. And that is the devices that are connected to your computer, how they're connected, the wiring, the interfaces, the connectors, the hubs, everything around your computer that needs to travel from one generation of technology to the next. Now, in each of the many times that I've upgraded my studio in 25 years, I've had to deal with this to some extent. But I think this time it's going to be a little bit different. As I mentioned in part 1, and referring back to Rick Beato's rant on Apple, there's a ton of adapters already involved with my existing studio. And that will probably become more prevalent as I bring in the new computer because it's got so many new different adapters, and I'll have many ways that I can update and upgrade and get a lot more out of the way that I connect everything to the computer. But that's not all I'm dealing with. This is not just a wiring issue. I have many things that have, to some extent, fallen into disrepair and even disuse in my studio because I don't have enough room and space and because I didn't have enough connectors to have everything hooked up at the same time. I've got some really good equipment sitting on the floor, like my Slate Digital touchscreen mixing board, because I just don't have enough room. So as part of my upgrade, and anytime I upgrade to a new computer, I do this examination of my ecosystem, and in this case, I will probably actually be doing a little extra work, a little construction even, to be able to have everything in the right place and everything hooked up as I make this major change from one generation of technology to another. How do we let that happen? How does our studio that we set out to make perfect get into a little bit of disrepair, as I mentioned? Well, even when you start from scratch, and with this studio I started from scratch. I built out space and had the chance to really do it right, and that was my intention. And my studio was always going to be clean and neat and great looking wiring. And, you know, sometimes things just don't go the way we think they will over the years. And you get to the point where, yes, it's time to revisit, and you have a chance to wipe the slate clean and start over to some extent as you bring in a new wave of technology. So we're going to cover several different aspects of this. And I do fortunately have a couple of months to address these issues. Some of you who follow the channel a little bit may know that over the last couple of years, I had intended to actually completely remodel the studio. But COVID kind of did what it did in a lot of areas. For many of us, it put plans on hold. In this case, I can't put my plans on hold. As I mentioned in part 1, my computer's dying. I've got to upgrade and I've got to update. So I'm going to do everything I can in the couple of months that we have. So let's saddle up. Let's dive in and take a look at the problem. And that's the first thing we're going to do is we're going to catalog the areas that I really need to pay attention to as I prepare to replace the heart of my studio. Let's dive in. Before we can start making changes, we've really got to catalog some of the problems and some of the changes that have to be made. And to do that, we have to take an honest look at our studio. On the surface, my studio looks great, but you don't have to change your angle too terribly much to start seeing some of the problems. Some of the wiring issues, connection issues, access issues, some of the equipment that's on the floor that there isn't room to set up that I want to take care of that I mentioned earlier. Some of the rat's nests that have just simply developed over time. No, there's no grommet in that hole behind the drums. These are some of the things that I want to take the opportunity to take care of while I really have to be in a position to really know what connects to what and where everything's going as I put the new computer system in place. So we'll jump in with identification first. We've got to identify what all the problems are. We've got to know where every wire comes from and goes to. We've got to correct some of the sins over the last 6 or 7 years since I've been in this home with this home studio. And then we'll be in a position to do what we need to do to correct the problems. Before we start moving anything around, and particularly before we start disconnecting things, we need to catch up on our labeling. It's been a while since I did some labeling, although I did a couple of cables on one of our episodes not long ago. So I really have some catching up to do. Now, fortunately, I have some good tools for the job here. This is a Brother label printer, P-Touch label printer. This is the second generation of it that I've used. It's a pretty interesting little device. It's very compact. It's pretty easy to set up and use. And so we're going to go ahead and use this to crank out some labels. Now I got it all loaded up with the cassettes that they use to print labels and that kind of thing. So what we're going to do is we're just going to figure out what labels we need, what I'm connecting to, and then we'll attach the labels. Okay, this is not really intended to be a training session on the P-Touch printer or a pitch for the P-Touch printer, but since we're here, I'll just show you that this is a fairly easy little app to use. Once you selected your output label format and that kind of thing, it's very easy to edit. So I'll just make one here for the keyboard, and you can see that it mirrors on both sides. We told it was a two-sided label, so that is very easy to do. And then printing is equally easy to do. You're just going to click on print and tell it how many labels that you want to print. There's our printer. So when I give the order to print, it's going to go ahead and give me a little chop from the last print job it did, and then it prints the label and cuts it. So then the only real headache you're left with is separating the back of the label from the label. But other than that, pretty straightforward. Now here again, I don't want the label to be too close to the connection to the hub, so I'm going to put it back a ways. You do want to pay attention to which side up the printing is on the label. You can see that label's a little tough to deal with there. So I'm going to go ahead and attach it right about in the middle and do my best to match up the two sides. And there we go. Well, I've got that good feeling that you get when something that you know you've needed to do for a long time is done. So I've got everything labeled that's connected to the back of my current iMac computer. And no really huge surprises there as far as what I have plugged into the various interfaces. But let's review what is plugged into the iMac right now and how it's plugged in. Okay, so on the iMac, we have many ports in the back of it, nowhere near as many as the new Mac Studio will have. There are two Thunderbolt 3 ports in the back of the iMac, and on the Mac Studio there are 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports on the back. So into the Thunderbolt 3 I currently have two things plugged in. One is, and this uses an adapter, goes to my ATM Mini Pro. That's a Blackmagic device. That's very, very handy, little mini studio. And I use that primarily to be able to get screenshots, which you're actually looking at right now, from my iMac over to my MacBook Pro so I can make these videos. So that's one of them. The other is used for my Motu 828X. And that can be done through other interfaces, like just a standard USB interface, but the Thunderbolt interface is the fastest interface for that real-time audio. So that's why I use it for that. Okay, we then, on the back of the iMac, we have 3 USB-A connectors. And after I did this review, I actually unplugged a couple of things that I didn't need to have plugged in. So really right now, only one of those is being used. Port number 2 has a 7-port USB hub, which is USB 3 connectors into that hub. And the USB hub is got the following plugged into it. In port 1, it has a wireless mouse adapter. In port 2, it has an iLock. Yes, I have to have an iLock for some of the software that I have. I am a little concerned about the iLock being able to make it over to the new Mac, but it should. Hopefully that will not be a problem. In port 3, I have a 9 terabyte LaCie hard drive. I actually have 2 of those, but they are daisy-chained, and one of them I'm not using yet. So that is currently going in there. I will look forward to being able to put that directly into its own Thunderbolt port to have maximum bandwidth and maximum performance from that device. In port 4, I have a Motu XT, MIDI XT device that allows me to have a lot of MIDI devices plugged in, which I use. In port 5, I've got my TD30 directly plugged in. That's in the studio, so that has a fairly long USB cable that connects it. Port 6. I've got a special adapter that does not need to be there all the time, but my Variax guitar setup requires a special adapter to do an update of it, and I don't do that very often, so I could probably unplug that and not have that plugged in all the time, but it's not hurting anything, so there it is. And then port 7 is the keyboard. So nothing too dramatic here. There are things I don't have plugged in. I've mentioned my Slate digital screen a couple of times, a couple of other things that I can probably go ahead and plug in. But as I have not got the space to set up the Slate digital, I'll probably wait until after I have done my remodel of this space to do that. Now, I mentioned that I have quite a few adapters, but I'm limiting this to only those that are directly connected into the iMac in one way or another. And there are not that many. I have many more that are actually connected into my PowerBook. And when I'm talking about adapters, I'm talking about the ability to get one device plugged into another via a cable. What does it take if you can't just buy a cable that has what you need on both ends? What are the adapters? And this is the issue, by the way, as you'll recall, that drove Rick Beato over the edge is the incredible amount of money you have to spend on adapters. In this particular case, I really only have 2 that are in use on the iMac and the hub that it's connected to. One is a Thunderbolt to HDMI because there's no native HDMI on the iMac, so I use one of the Thunderbolts to get an HDMI in capability to the iMac. I've only got one of those. And then I have several of these very nice little adapters to go from a USB-C male end and transfer that over to a USB 3. And these little guys are not expensive. You can get them very easily off of Amazon. On one end, you've got the USB-C in, and then that turns that into a USB 3. And I've got 3 or 4 of those plugged in here. Okay, so now I've got a clear picture of what's plugged in and what some of the possible items are that will need to be changed. I think I will for sure be looking at a new USB hub, as this hub is several years old. I hope that some good advances have been made there. especially for being able to plug in USB-C natively into the hub. I'll be trying not to use a hub for as many things as possible, and with the number of interfaces and USB 3 and USB-C interfaces on my new Mac Studio, hopefully I'll be doing a lot less through a hub, because the hub, while very, very efficient, puts a lot of bandwidth over one connection into the computer. I want to spread that out to the different controllers that are in the new computer. All right, that's our review and documentation of what is plugged into my iMac right now. Whether you're a newspaper editor or a YouTube content creator, you never want to have to correct errata. But rather than reshoot the entire last scene I just did, I'm just going to update you with one thing I forgot. I realized that, hey, wait a minute, where's my Motu 1248 plugged in? And I missed a USB port. So there are actually 4 USB 3 ports on the back of my iMac, and one of them is plugged into my Motu 1248 out in the studio. So the 1248 is plugged directly into the back of the iMac through one of the 4 USB 3 ports. So that completes the picture of what's plugged in and how on my current iMac setup. Now that we've identified some of the issues surrounding the ecosystem of the heart of my studio, I'm ready to put some fixes in place. In part 3, we're going to be calling in some resources I've worked with in the past to engineer some solutions to the problems we've identified with the cabling and wiring, some rat's nests, and getting my Slate Digital up off the floor and back into production, and getting the environment ready to receive the new computer that will be coming in just a few weeks now. Join us for part 3. We'll see you then.
I wish that I could put you in my pocket, so we would be together when I'm away. But I can't find a shirt with a big enough pocket, big enough for you and all your things. So I guess that I